Well, friends, we've made it to 2 Samuel, which means we are about to learn all about the second king of Israel, King David. There's going to be new laws. There's going to be a new capital of the country. It's going to be a whole thing, so get ready for a Dave new world. Hey everybody, welcome to our journey through Scripture. My name is Austin. Today we are going to be talking about the second part of Samuel, 2 Samuel, as you might have expected it to be called. 2 Samuel can be split into three different parts. The first part is from chapter 1 to 10, and that's all about David's being crowned king, his getting his kingship together, and expanding his empire. In chapters 11 through 20, the second part, David has family problems, and they are big, big problems. And then the last bit, chapters 1 to 24, are miscellaneous documents that have to do with David's reign as king. So if you watched last week's video, you'll remember that I made a big deal about David and Jonathan's love and how romantic it was, but we kind of ended on a sad note because at the end of 1 Samuel, both Saul and his son Jonathan do die, and so that was kind of where we left it. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we get this final glimpse of David's love for Jonathan. We read David's elegy or mourning song for Jonathan and for Saul, and verses 25 and 26 say, "How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon the high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women." So it's really sad. I always think of David and Jonathan as like the Romeo and Juliet of the Old Testament. They were just these sort of star-crossed lovers that never could make it work because of the way that things just turned out for them and the way that their families were, but it's still a pretty romantic story. But even though David's pretty heartbroken, he can't stop because the whole country is in a mess. Nobody knows who's going to become king after Saul. In chapters 2 through 4, David fights with Saul's oldest son and Saul's old military captain, and they have all these skirmishes and battles, but eventually David wins. In chapter 5, David is crowned king and officially makes Jerusalem the sort of capital or seat of his power, and he moves into Jerusalem. But first he has to defeat the people that are currently living in Jerusalem, and there's this weird thing that happens. I want you to put a pin in it. So here's what happens. David gets to Jerusalem, and it's a really mighty city, and David knows he's going to have to sort of besiege it to get in. And apparently the ruler of Jerusalem at that time said that the city was so strong that even the blind and lame will turn David back. In response, during the conquest, David tells his men to attack the blind and lame in the city first. Chapter 5, verse 8 says, "Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house." So just keep that in mind because we're going to talk about it a little bit later. In chapter 6, David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. So this thing that God has sort of stayed in, it's sort of like if you think about God having a tent among the Israelites, that's the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it's moved around with the Israelite people. But now David is going to bring it into Jerusalem for the first time and sort of give it a home there. David creates this whole parade all the way from where the ark was being kept all the way to Jerusalem. It's a huge thing, and David himself goes ahead of the parade like the front runner of the parade, dancing and making music. Chapter 6, verse 14 tells us, "David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod." Now, an ephod is kind of an interesting garment. It was something that the temple priests wore. It was something a lot of people wore at the time. The priests obviously had their special kind, but it was kind of if you can imagine a front and back of overalls with kind of a loincloth thing going on below, or kind of an apron maybe, but on both sides. Anyways, it didn't cover all of you. So one of David's wives, Michal, who also happens to be one of Saul's daughters that David married, Michal looks out the window and she sees David dancing, and we see in verse 16 that she despised him in her heart. So when David gets back and the parade is all over, Michal goes to David and she says, super sarcastically, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." So essentially, she shames David for having this sort of small amount of clothing on, which you can imagine probably bounced around a lot when David was dancing, and people probably saw things they weren't crazy about seeing, but that's just what happened at this parade. So David's response to this is, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes, but by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. So for celebrating in the sight of God and everybody, and for not being ashamed of his body or his joy or his celebration of life, for all of that this week, we are giving David the Quiro Award. I'm officially recognizing David for being the Grand Marshal of the first Pride Parade. Okay, but for real. So in chapter 7, we get back to the serious stuff. In chapter 7, God makes the covenant with David, which is like the big narrative turning point. David starts thinking about creating a house for God. Like, I have a house now. I have a seat in Jerusalem. Maybe I'll create a house for God. But turns out God doesn't want a house quite yet. God comes to David and says, no, you're not the one that's supposed to build me a house. Don't even worry about it. But instead, I'm going to build you a house. And what God means by that is that God promises to David that when David dies, his family will continue on to be sort of the ruling family and will continue to be blessed. Individually, even though David and the rest of his family might screw up, God promises to never take God's favor away from that family. It's a huge promise, and it sets up the whole rest of our story all the way into the New Testament. So, up through chapter 10, David is out, he's conquering more places, he's bringing more people into his new sort of empire that he's building, but we also have one really interesting and sweet story. In chapter 9, David asks, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" As it turns out, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive, and his name is Mephibosheth. That is a tongue twister, Mephibosheth. So, Mephibosheth was just a baby when this whole thing was going down between David and Saul, and it turns out what happened was his nurse carried him away to try to save him from possibly being killed by one of David's men, and as she was running, she fell, and she dropped him, and his legs were damaged. His legs were broken in some way. So Mephibosheth is known for being a person who has a disability. But Mephibosheth is still out there, and when David hears about it, he gets really excited, and he invites Mephibosheth to come stay with him. And when he gets to David's palace, David says, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." Verse 11 tells us Mephibosheth ate at David's table just like one of the king's sons. Now, this is a really sweet story, the way that love can kind of transcend and go through generations, right? It's really sweet. But more than that, it's a direct backtracking of what David said several chapters ago when he was besieging Jerusalem and said that nobody who was blind or lame would be allowed into his house. It's just another time in the Bible, and we're going to see many more of these still coming up, but it's another one of those times in the Bible where a rule is made and then broken by the sheer strength of love. It's again that arc moving from exclusion to inclusion for all kinds of people. Unfortunately, chapters 11 and 12, the next two chapters coming up, are anything but sweet. In chapter 11, David is out on the roof of his palace, and he sees a woman bathing across the way. You can imagine David's palace is quite tall at this point, and he can see the roofs of other places, and he sees a woman bathing out on her roof. The woman's name is Bathsheba, and she's married to a man named Uriah, and David essentially sees her and decides that he wants her and commands her to be brought to him. She's, of course, required to come to where he is because he's the king, and so she does, and he sleeps with her, and she gets pregnant, and when David finds out about it, he sends her husband Uriah to the front lines of the battle that's going on at the moment, and essentially gets him killed. This moment in the story is, of course, important for the larger narrative, but I think it's also an important moment for us to think about the importance of power dynamics. So in her book, Womanist Midrash, Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney says, "When David sends for Bathsheba, she does not have the option to refuse his invitation, nor do his men have the option to refuse to bring her. The description of her going with the messengers may suggest to some readers that she complies or participates willingly. However, the absolute power of an ancient Near Eastern monarch, combined with the absence of her husband's protection, greatly reduce Bathsheba's ability to consent to the sexual encounter. Rape is an abuse of power that can include relational and positional power, in addition to physical power. The power dynamic here is clear. David uses the power and authority of his office to wield lethal violence to keep Bathsheba." The reason I bring this up is because before I went to seminary and had to take classes on things like boundaries and power dynamics, I didn't know any of this stuff. And what I mean is, a lot of us aren't educated about this stuff. A lot of us don't know about things like social power dynamics and why they're important for our personal relationships. It's incredibly important when we think about having a relationship with somebody in our life that we think about what power imbalances there might be. Are you a student and she's a professor? Are you a CEO and he's an assistant? Are you a customer and they're a fast food worker who's basically bound by their job to give you what you want? There are power imbalances in all of those situations that can cause real harm in people's lives. And so I think that what can be important about this story is the negative model that David shows us about how power can work. If you're wondering about power imbalances in your relationships, I'm going to put a link with helpful information and contact info down below in the description, so check that out. All right, so the new prophet in town, Nathan, he comes to David to basically tell him that he's done something wrong and God is not happy. In chapter 12, God promises to raise up trouble from within David's own family as punishment for this huge, heinous sin. David realizes the terrible thing he's done and repents, but the baby that Bathsheba was pregnant with still dies as part of that punishment, which is awful. And David mourns, and we assume Bathsheba mourns, although we don't really hear, because right away David goes back to her and gets her pregnant again, and this time the baby lives, and the baby's name is Solomon. In chapters 13 through 20, we see things go from bad to worse for David's family. First, David's daughter, Tamar, is raped by David's oldest son, Amnon. And as terrible as that is by itself, it's made worse by the fact that when David finds out about it, he doesn't do anything. He actually protects Amnon, because Amnon is supposed to be his heir, right? But David's son, who's next in line to the throne after Amnon, his name is Absalom. And Absalom loved his sister Tamar very much, and so he actually, in vengeance, kills his brother Amnon. David exiles Absalom for several years and then finally invites him back because, this is the new heir to the kingdom, and you can't really kick him out forever. But this whole time that Absalom has been out there, he has been getting and gaining favor from the people. So he's known as this avenger, right? But he is also apparently just a really well-liked guy. And so he's been out there kind of spreading it around and getting people to join his cause because he's not super happy with David. In chapter 15, Absalom straight up declares that he's king now and decides he's going to attack Jerusalem and take David out. David and Absalom's armies fight, and it's like this is David's own family rising up against him, right? This is what was supposed to happen because of the whole Bathsheba thing. So they fight for several chapters. Finally, Absalom is killed when he's swept off his horse by a branch and then taken out by one of David's soldiers. David mourns for his son Absalom so much so that he shuts himself away and won't talk to anybody. And some of his military commanders eventually come to him and say, hey, you know what? All of the people think that you care more about Absalom than the people who fought for you, and they're not super happy. So, nobody's happy. Everything is a mess. 2 Samuel ends with just some random snippets of stories in chapters 21 through 24, which include a story about David trading a bunch of Saul's sons and grandsons as prisoners of war, but keeping Mephibosheth safe. All in all, this is a pretty sad ending for this book. Everything is a mess yet again. So what do we take out of this as LGBTQ Christians? I think for me, the strength of this book is that it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of power dynamics and power shifts, and also the way power corrupts. David the shepherd boy, who fell in love with a prince and killed Goliath, was a totally different guy than the one who created an empire and conquered tons of people and thought that he was entitled to other people's bodies and lives. I think as we work for justice for LGBTQ plus folks, and especially LGBTQ plus people of faith, as we work in these areas, we have to remember that it's really easy to climb up a ladder by stomping on the people below you. As we work to create justice and create equity and equality for LGBTQ plus people, let's never forget that when we feel like we're getting towards the top, our job is to jump down and lift from the bottom. Thanks so much for watching this week, everybody. I really appreciate it, and I especially appreciate the folks over at Patreon who make these videos possible, including Brian and Laurel and Donald. If you want to keep this series going, please head over to patreon.com/AustinLionheart, where you can check out some cool perks and find out how to support me and these videos and the education I do with churches so that they can learn to be more LGBTQ plus inclusive and knowledgeable about trans identities. Next week, we'll be continuing the story of the kings with a book called First Kings. Surprise! We're about to get to the story of the biggest family man in the Bible, Solomon, and by that I mean he had the biggest family. We're going to talk about biblical family values. It's going to be great. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. Until next week, keep reading.